Okay, everybody, thanks so much and good evening. It's a pleasure to have you here with us for this evening's webinar on international cooperation in responding to crisis. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City. Through the year, we talk about what's going on around the world and how it connects with our community here. We regularly invite journalists, professors, diplomats, and other subject matter experts to share their insights with us, and it's our pleasure to have you here this evening. We're proud to present this evening's program in partnership with the National World War I Museum and Memorial, also found here in Kansas City. Besides its extensive collection of World War I artifacts, the Museum and Memorial puts on a range of excellent and informative programming through the year. I'm sure you'll hear about some of their upcoming offerings this evening. We've been doing our best at the IRC to lean into digital programming for all sorts of audiences and interests, and we sincerely hope that you'll join us for other digital programs in the weeks ahead. Please check out our Lexicon bite-sized language intros, including the language of Turkish, after this program this evening, our International Career Series, and our News and Views discussion groups. Next Tuesday, June 2nd, we'll be joined by Tamana Salakudin, Director of South Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She will be discussing conflict and cooperation in South Asia, with a focus on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. For more information on the International Relations Council, including how to join as a member, we invite you to visit our website at irckc.org. Thank you again for being here this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, Laura Vogt, Curator of Education at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, who will introduce our guests from the Center for Civilians in Conflict and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Laura, thank you so much.
Matthew, thank you. And thank you for all of you who are attending. It really is a pleasure to spend just a portion of this evening with you in some really important conversation. First, a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you take a look at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see that there is a Q&A button. And it would be wonderful, and it's actually one of the benefits of doing these online events, is that you don't have to remember your question. As soon as you think of your question, you can type it into that Q&A box, and at the end of our conversation, we will do that Q&A time. It will be about a 35-minute conversation. We'll try to leave a healthy amount of time for your questions. Again, that really is the benefit of a virtual conversation like this. And I highly recommend some of these other virtual conversations that they are doing at IRC. If you didn't notice, they've got cooking classes that are going on that just will make your mouth water. Now, if you're looking for a little bit of historic cooking, I would invite you to go to www.theworldwar.org. We've got an online exhibition called Warfare. It actually has an entire digitized World War I cookbook. And if you, like so many others, are getting your baking on right now, there are some new, maybe to you, but very old recipes that might have exactly what you need when you are relying on some pantry staples. Later this week, I would also invite you to join us in the National World War II Museum. You can check out our, again, website, theworldwar.org, just /online, and you can see the online link to a webinar on the influenza pandemic of 1918 and how that leads to innovation during World War II. We are not just going to be online starting Monday, June 1st for members and Tuesday, June 2nd for all. We are opening our doors in a safe way. Again, check out the website, but we would certainly welcome you. It's going to be in 2 sessions. There'll be a morning session, a time for kind of some deep cleaning in the in-between, and then a second session afterwards, a nice opportunity to kind of dig a little deeper into our nation's history. All of that can be found on our website, theworldwar.org. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce the two panelists that you see here with us. Sam Brannen leads the Risk and Foresight Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also known as CSIS, and is a senior fellow in the International Security Program. He's previously served as a long-range strategic planner and advisor to senior leaders in government and business. Sam returned to CSIS in the fall of 2018 after spending 4 years as the director of A.T. Kearney's Global Business Policy Council, where he advised CEOs on the business implications of global macro trends and conducted 5 to 10-year assessments of countries, sectors, and industries. Brannen has held multiple positions at the Pentagon, including advising on strategy and foresight issues and serving as country director for Turkey in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Dan Mahanty is the director of Civic's U.S. program, where he engages U.S. policymakers to promote the adoption of policies and practices that enhance the protection of civilians in conflict, including through international security cooperation and assistance. Prior to joining Civic, Dan spent 16 years at the United States Department of State. In 2012, he created and led the Office of Security and Human Rights in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And in this role, he oversaw efforts to integrate human rights in U.S. security assistance and arms sales, advance the prevention of recruitment and the use of child soldiers, and promote policies related to protecting civilians in conflict. He is a Colin L. Powell Fellow, a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a Truman National Security Fellow, and served on the board of advisors for the NGO Women Lead Nepal. Dan has also graced the museum and memorial stage on 2 other occasions. We spoke at U.S. Global Engagement and the Military. You can find that conversation online at our YouTube channel, and also for the live recording of the hit podcast, Bombshell. Gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to be in conversation today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Wonderful. That was also the nice little mic check to make sure that everybody's microphones are working. So part of the mission at the National World War I Museum and Memorial is understanding the enduring impacts of World War I. And one of which is the role and the evolution of international cooperation. Now, last year, we commemorated the centennial of the Paris Peace Conference in June of 2019 for the signing of that, including as part of that conference, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, many then and now consider that to have been a diplomatic failure for its inability to create the infrastructure for a more peaceful and stable world. One of its important, and many consider positive legacies, was its creation of the League of Nations, which produced an organization precedent for nations dealing cooperatively and the blueprint for the United Nations. So there's this idea of international organization and cooperation that is one both of you are familiar with, and one that is on the hearts and minds of many of us around the world as we're navigating this COVID pandemic. So it's a 2-part question here. Are there I'll start with just one. How about that? Are there any good examples of collaboration that we can look to in history in response to crisis?
Dan, do you want me to start?
Yeah, I feel like as the first time visitor to our fantastic arena here, Sam, why don't you go ahead and take the lead, and then I'll
Well, Laura and Matthew, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you and these 2 institutions, and your mission and mandate are critical. And I think it's, when we look to history for examples, really what we find are more instances of lack of cooperation, and the very direct outcomes of that lack of cooperation being hardship on all nations. And so that's actually kind of the situation we're in now. And I think we'll probably turn back to that in full. But in terms of cooperation between nations, in my lifetime, probably the most impactful example was the response to the 9/11 attacks. And those of you who remember what September 12th, 2001 felt like, it was united at home and abroad. And I was actually, Laura and I were talking about our Turkey connection earlier. I was an undergraduate at the time in my senior year studying in Turkey. And I remember the sort of warmth that I got from the Turkish people who had had their own experiences with terrorism. It was a uniting issue. And in countries around the world, even Russia and China, countries we have tough relationships with today, even Iran to a limited extent, there were offers of assistance to the United States. And so that was an example where the international community came together briefly. I think we were later divided by differences of opinion on how to proceed after the Afghanistan war and even in the lead up. But that to me is the example that really stands out. And I think in many ways, there's a lot of cooperation after 9/11 through to my time at the Pentagon when I was working in the Europe and NATO office, with the commitment of many countries around the world to counterterrorism, committing troops to various locations abroad, and a lot of diplomatic work together, a lot of foreign assistance work together. So there certainly was a recent instance where we had a crisis and we came together as an international community.
The second part of the question, and you led so well into that, Sam, what compels countries to support each other individually or collectively, in the past or in the present?
So I would say, and I want to turn it over to Dan, put him on the spot here too. But I'll say, it is, they're acting in their own interest first and foremost. And so the leaders have to believe that it's in their interest to cooperate with other countries, that it does more to advance their own interests over the long term than it does not to. And so you have to have some sort of a calculation in the minds of leaders that they will sort of eventually get at least what they give and maybe a little bit more back. And that can be in indirect ways, like a stable international system.
Yeah, I mean, it will come as no surprise probably that, of course, I endorse and agree with most of all of what Sam said as a principal expert in this field. I just offer a couple additional thoughts, maybe just by way of reflection or addition. I think Sam put his finger on, or put the hammer on the nail, or his finger on the nose, or whatever it is, when he spoke a little bit about the difference between the daily acts of cooperation we see in an interconnected, globe as it is now, whether that's economic cooperation or security cooperation. I mean, it's really hard to look around the world and miss instances of some form of cooperation on a daily basis. This challenge of collective cooperation in the face of a hardship, that's really affecting all countries, and in many cases, facing us in many of the same ways, I think is the real challenge. And I think from that, to draw upon your question a little bit, Laura, in terms of looking at instances from history, I would like to think that those who are charged with coming up with what the order might look like after World War II, as opposed to World War I, took something from that experience in a couple of ways. One, I think understanding, as Sam said, that no one country would be strong enough to deal with a shared challenge, as well as a number of countries would be able to deal with them together. And in this case, fundamental questions of peace and security. But there was another, I think, at least maybe less visible, but nonetheless present feature of that period in history, in which I do think there was some aspect of collective humility too, and reflection of what mistakes had been made and where critical errors had kind of driven the international community towards a recurrence of a crisis that they had once, most of them had already experienced by that time. And so I think, as we get further in the conversation about what international cooperation might look like going forward, yes, looking at, the independent motivations of states and what's driving states to cooperate, but also wondering if there aren't ways that we can learn from this experience of failure in a way, in a moment of reflection and humility, to say, how can we make sure everybody is brought along the next time around for a more successful, experience the next time.
Oh, absolutely. And Dan, you make a really, really good point. After World War I, we see all of these fractures that happen in global relationships. And many of those are because of the leadership choices made in this crucible of economic, social, and political crisis after the war. Now, an example would be the U.S. Refused to kind of renegotiate the loans that was owed by France, which in turn put France in a really tight position because Germany was supposed to be paying reparations to France. And if we know anything, or if we remember anything from our high school, our high school class on history and the Treaty of Versailles, one of the things that's in every U.S. history textbook is that the reparations were really drastic and were far higher than Germany was going to be able to pay. And politicians in the era knew that was certainly the case. To put the reparations, it's going to put an onus on everyday people, and it's going to cause just a tremendous amount of problem. There are lots of books about that. If you're interested, I'll have suggestions. You can ask it as a question afterwards. So there's a lot of stuff that's negative. There's also a lot of stuff in this post-war time that shows how everyday people are able to step up to this moment, to engage. There is documentable growth of how humanitarianism and American philanthropy are strengthened. We've actually got some exhibitions online as well about philanthropy and volunteerism. Anyone who's interested in more information on that World War I site, feel free. Another great thing about virtual events like this is you can multitask. You can do both at the same time. Dan, Sam, and I just aren't even going to know. So you can be boning up on your World War I as we continue the conversation, right? You've got things like volunteers to China to help with cholera, the growth of the Red Cross. You've got a famine happening in Russia and some aid and things like that. Andrew Carnegie. Can you all comment on how, not in that historic sense, but today we may see either this fracturing in global relationships because of leadership choices, or this kind of positive, this moment of philanthropy and humanitarianism? Either or both of those today.
I guess in the sense of alternating a little bit, and I'll be brief because I'd really love to hear Sam's thoughts on this, because he just wrote a fantastic article on kind of the potential trajectory, which I think will affect the prospects of both of these things. I think the historical record probably, if it passes prelude, I think we'll probably see some features of both of those things, Laura. My guesses would be there will be what has been described as an acceleration of trends in the negative. In other words, perhaps a more rapid polarization of power and economic, inequity. Perhaps an acceleration of some of the nationalistic trends we've seen, or the popularity of nationalist parties in certain countries, where autocrats and leaders are really trying to consolidate their hold on power or their monopoly on a political position, because there is more tension, there is more stress, there are more demands on a limited number of resources and power. So I think you could see some of that, and the extent to which the international community is able to contend with that, I think, is really going to depend on the character and motivation of individual leaders who possess the wherewithal and the temperament to stand up and to say, look, we can deal with these challenges if we work together. We need to serve as honest brokers and comparative evaluators of one another's conduct, thinking about questions of human rights, thinking about questions of equality, but also we need to invest in those things to ensure that going forward, those who stand the most to lose from that phenomenon are brought along. And I think that's one potentially valuable lesson from the post-World War II era, again, is that we often look at this as kind of like the halcyon days of the post-World War II international order, but there were structures that were put in place that probably did bypass or overlook segments of the population around the world, countries and interests that really led to some of the violence we saw during the Cold War. So something to keep in mind. I think on the positive side, though, I mean, the world is really well equipped at this point, to really maximize the contributions of individuals in civil society and international organizations if it lets it. And this is why I think if we conceive of international cooperation in the broadest possible terms, away from just states cooperating with one another, but also the channels and interactions that exist between other entities within states, we stand the best chance of recognizing those contributions, investing in them, and giving them space to grow. And this is where I think states have to think about not just going to, capitals in Western Europe to talk about the next response to pandemic, but also thinking about how do they create the space, the channels, the opportunities, and the capacity of non-state organizations to do the work that they do in situations like this. So I said I was going to be brief, which was a total lie, but I'm going to turn it over to Sam now for his thoughts.
No, thanks, Dan. I am in violent agreement with you as well. And Laura, I appreciate the question, because I think a lot of the discussion has focused on national governments, to some degree local governments, and then business. But we've left out civil society, and particularly in the United States, we have 2 million nonprofit organizations, which is a staggering number when you think about it. And some of these have a global focus, some of them have a local focus. There's civil society all over the world. And all of these are engaged in the response in one way, shape, or form. One of the most important figures in the midst of all of this is Bill Gates. He's not an elected official. He's the founder of Microsoft, and he is a philanthropist who's focused on global health and is now helping really behind the scenes to guide all kinds of efforts that are vital in the response effort, and is using an infrastructure that he's built up dealing with public health challenges that frankly governments and international organizations weren't adequately addressing. And so the power of civil society and individuals is huge. The other area I would highlight is, even though US and Chinese politicians are fighting now in a very public way, US and Chinese scientists are trading information. There are huge links in the science community that are really more active than they've ever been before. The pace of scientific progress, even though it feels very slow because we're all at home and locked down, what's happening is really amazing. And so the solution from this is going to come way more from these other channels, these non-governmental channels. So even though a lot of us, I think, are in various countries around the world are disappointed in how government responded domestically, what it's doing internationally, there's a lot that's going on that's just outside of government's channels. And the age that we live in may be one in which government needs to act fundamentally different, and our expectations of it need to be quite different. And really there are things that so it's a different world than the First World War, but some overlap in the importance of what individuals and civil society can do. I think you're muted there, Laura, sorry.
The really nice thing about Zoom is it will put a box out to remind you that you are muted. Dan mentioned a really great article, Sam, that you wrote. And if you're actually on the Zoom call, you can see, I've just placed a link to that article in the chat section. Feel free to grab that, open that up in a tab so that you can read that later on, because clearly you're going to want to ask the question to the man himself. But the really wonderful article there for you to take a look at. Sam, you were talking, and again, this co-author piece does include several models on recovery. Are there some real specifics that you think need to be addressed for the most favorable outcome possible at this point?
Yeah, so some colleagues at my organization and I got together at the beginning of this thing, and we said it's all very uncertain, the way that things are going to go. And we needed to sort of be able to think about it and talk about it in an informed way, even covering all that uncertainty of how's this pandemic going to go. And it really all comes back to the public health sort of course that we're on. How quickly do we get testing? How quickly do we get treatments? How quickly do we get a vaccine? Is there a second wave? Is there a third wave? How do the healthcare systems hold up? All of that drives, in turn, the economic and political and social outcomes. And so by mapping with our colleagues, Steve Morrison at CSIS, who has a great weekly podcast on coronavirus issues with speakers from around the country and the world, sat down and helped us come up with what are the 3 courses that this could go. And then we talked with our economics colleagues and our energy colleagues and talked about, what are the pathways that would happen then in terms of how quickly can we sort of get back to normal. And we've been watching now for 2 months to see what path are we on. And a lot of people, when this had started, had thought about the 2003, 2004 SARS epidemic in Asia, which came on very strong, was a very scary moment for those in public health, but didn't go pandemic, was an epidemic, largely concentrated in Canada and in China, Hong Kong. And they were anticipating this sort of V-shaped recovery. The economy goes down, it goes back up. Life gets back to normal quickly. We're not in that world. Unfortunately, this virus is much more transmissible. It's already far wider spread. It presents itself differently. It's sort of the once in a century, very difficult scenario that people who've been looking at pandemics hoped wouldn't come up, and it has. And so the V-shaped recovery is out. The best we could sort of hope for is a U-shape, where we're sort of scraping bottom. We might have hit bottom in March. Globally, economic figures show we sort of leveled off, at least in April. We're still getting more jobless claims in the US and so forth. And then it goes back up as soon as you sort of get to a vaccine or a cure, or you manage this. It's sort of what South Korea has now, or what Israel, or some countries that were able to get a handle on this and really reduce caseloads and manage. Taiwan, New Zealand. So they're sort of in that U-shaped world. What we're afraid of is that we're in kind of a W world, where we're sort of on a little recovery. Potentially this summer, we're opening back up, but we're not where we need to be in testing and in sort of overall response capacity. And so we're going to be on a little bit of a roller coaster ride, where there will be cities and instances and countries around the world that go back into a lockdown if they came out of it. And it might do that repeatedly because, of course, we're trying to keep health systems from being overwhelmed, and we're trying to limit the spread. And that's the only tool that we have so far in the toolkit, is social distancing. And so we're hoping that all these trials that are going on everywhere give us something that allows us to control things. Vaccine, best case scenario, sort of end of this year for medical responders, and early next year maybe for a broader critical portion of the population. And we can sort of get used to managing things in the meantime and not worry about our health system being overrun. So I'm afraid it's complicated. And then the worst case of all is you never get to a vaccine, but it looks like now, thankfully, that's not where we're going to end up. There, as I said, the pace of science is remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Sam, that is a spectacular job of kind of setting the scene for us, not only the present, but also the future expectations. Dan, the pandemic has certainly affected global communities, and one of the really important ones for us to consider in a conversation like this is the refugee community. Would you be able to speak to either the present or the expectations for the futures? One of the great things about speaking to leaders in international response are their preparation for things that may be coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've raised an issue that itself invites a broader conversation about how much stress this whole thing is putting on those who are already vulnerable to any form of disruptive crisis, let alone a global pandemic. And I think reading across the wealth of really sharp analysis that's come out of different entities around the effects of the pandemic on conflict afflicted areas like Somalia and Syria and Afghanistan, really is worth a moment of thoughtfulness and reflection about sort of how this crisis is affecting different communities. And it's not just refugees, whether internally displaced or people who are displaced to other countries. but the populations within conflict-afflicted countries that already have a hard time accessing basic services, that are already, basically on the receiving end of violence wielded by both state forces and our non-state groups. And it's the diminishing prospects of things getting better under those circumstances. So as we, consider the baseline and whether or not we'll ever return to a state of normalcy in places like the United States or Western Europe or South Korea, worth considering are those, the many states who are already, dealing with conflict and the people within and outside, but also the states that exist in a state of, fragility, who may be states that may be even more vulnerable to, conflicts to come, because of some of the political dimensions of the pandemic that may accelerate those dynamics. I don't think it's, we should say that that's a foregone conclusion. I think there are ways to mitigate against that risk, but it is certainly something to consider. And so as the listeners, think about, ways to help, I mean, even small things to do in terms of supporting those amazing and heroic international organizations that are, providing relief services, is really important. But also considering the political dimension of this, and doing things like supporting a global ceasefire, which was announced and seems, somewhat unrealistic, but at the same time, it's really the political dimension of conflict that needs to be affected and interrupted in order to give the humanitarian dimension the best chance of succeeding against really, really difficult odds, I think, at this moment.
As someone who works in history, and particularly in the era of World War I, there are, in our collection, object after object that reflect this sense of a moral obligation, that there was this ethical imperative, really for the nation to move forward and to assist. One of the great examples was Herbert Hoover and his efforts in food aid to Belgium in particular. There's one historian who said that was actually the greatest, that was the greatest international relief effort prior to the tsunami in Indonesia in the early 2000s. Can either of you speak to either your personal or the organizational belief that there is a global responsibility to engage in these spaces? And Dan, actually, as you were just pointing out, what is that mix between what is that political responsibility, and is there something else that we as nations, or that we as a global community should be rising up to, or I guess in some ways kind of trying to shed that cloak of apathy?
I will just say, I think that's a poignant reminder that U.S. engagement has been, I said states sort of behave in their own interests at the outset, but I think that leaders then elevate what that means. What is your interest? And so we've had periods of history where our leaders push our country into international engagement in a way that maybe people would resist it because it doesn't immediately look like it's in their interest. But with the right leaders, they sell it, they do it, and I think the country has always reaped the benefits of that in maybe not the immediate term, but the longer term, including the international architecture that we built from the lessons of the First World War after the Second World War, and that now we're pulling away from that, and others are doing the same. And it's a great moment to reflect on, what is in our interest. And the food crisis that you mentioned is an interesting parallel to the present, because right now in the midst of COVID, there is a parallel accelerating global food crisis that's unlike anything we've seen in, a generation. And so there's rising food insecurity in the United States and countries around the world. And it's a real opportunity for the United States as one of the great food and ag producers in the world to step up and do more. We haven't heard a lot of talk about that. I think that's a that's a huge opportunity. You know, rather than wasting effort and time getting in a argument with China about who is responsible for what, and lots of responsibility to go around in lots of ways, to lots of governments. But, you know, I think the person who history remembers and the person who will lead the world back from this is somebody who has that vision for what to do and how to bring countries together internationally. Because the other part is, the unique thing about a pandemic, when you talk about international cooperation, is you are never safe from a pandemic until it's gone in the world. You have to eradicate it everywhere. This has been our theory on polio, all kinds of things. And we did that because it was the right thing to do, but we also did it because scientifically you have to get rid of these reservoirs, and so of where the virus lives. So even if we inoculate everybody in the United States as an open country, open borders, that doesn't get us safety and security from this pathogen. And so that's why we have to take those broader efforts.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I think one thing that's you know, perhaps worth considering is that I think it's going to be a really significant challenge. And I think the challenge is getting harder by the day. And I think the first step, of course, is when you're in a hole, stop digging. And so hopefully, you know, sooner than later, we have some inspirational leadership from some, you know, yet unforeseen corner of the world that says, you know, we're going to step up and take charge here, in much of the spirit that Sam laid out. But the reason I say I think it's difficult and getting harder is because this is a moment at which, you know, a really noxious, you know, biological concern, you know, preys on structural deficiencies of government and allows, you know, the politically motivated to exploit a crisis in service of their own interests. And I think collective, you know, action and cooperation is really hard under circumstances when leaders are exploiting a crisis for their own benefit. And so I think what it will take is, what I'm hopeful for is to see leadership that not only appeals to the interests of their peers in other countries, but also leaders who together decide that they want to be courageous enough to forego the very narrow and short-term interests of self-preservation, and to look at some of the ways in which they actually can take some political risks, even some security risks, to open themselves up to cooperation. In our country, we even have a history of, you know, being sort of closed off to the prospect of sharing, you know, intellectual property when it comes to dealing with pandemic crises. And that's going to take some political courage and probably some innovation for a leader to say, you know, I can manage our domestic commercial interests in a way that serves them, but also allows us to step up and help globally. That's just, you know, one example, but I think it's, yeah, it's going to take nothing short of some really miraculous and courageous leadership, but I'm optimistic that we can get there.
I'm going to take this moment to remind all of you that if you've got a question, now is a really good time to click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and include that there, because this is going to be my last question to you all. And Dan, you set that up beautifully, you know, talking about this concept of what might we need. I think it's General Martin Dempsey, who used to be, former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. He said, some say this crisis is going to change us, then we should make it for the better. More open-minded, more inclusive, more honest, more charitable, kinder. We can do better than back to normal. So I would look to both of you. You've already actually spoken to some of them, this international scientific community collaboration on creating a vaccine. Are there other spaces that you are optimistic about for our collective futures before we head into some further Q&A?
I think, you know, a format like this, we're all digitally assembled here. We're using the internet for what we had hoped the internet would be used for, which is furthering connection and collaboration and exchange of ideas and borderless societies. And I think so we're actually leveraging technology in a way that's extremely beneficial in the midst of all of this. we spent a number of years talking about the downsides of technology, how authoritarian systems and governments were using them to suppress democracy and ideas. And here we are doing just the opposite. So I am heartened by sort of the innovation that is being forced on us. I think to General Dempsey's point, we're being forced into this, but that doesn't mean that we can't use it to sort of grow and evolve and sort of find our purpose, be a little bit humbled by the whole situation that we find ourselves in, no matter who we are or where we are. And the fact that we as human beings are all going through the same thing simultaneously in a place where, you know, borders are getting thicker and societies feel more and more disconnected. Here we are going through the same thing together. And if that doesn't build some degree of empathy with each other and opportunity to collaborate, I don't know what will.
I mean, this is an area where having a museum right in your backyard, and in the case of Sam, many museums right in his backyard, but I think the World War I Museum is so useful because it does remind us, you know, the value of looking at historical example. And I think if there's anything that provides a glimmer of hope, it's the example of history and what it provides us in terms of the resilience of humanity to come back from significant crises in a way that's better than, you know, what they went into it with. And I think, you know, this will be no exception to that, just as kind of Sam laid out and as your quote, I think helpfully, you know, framed. You know, I think the economy will, you know, could potentially be restructured in ways that's more equitable and probably, you know, innovate in ways that we don't even understand right now, just as a, you know, as a result of being compelled to do that. I certainly think, you know, I've seen so much more renewed interest in kind of not only connection over technology, but just human connection that could pay dividends that we were not able to understand or foresee quite yet. I certainly think and am hopeful that, you know, collectively we may be able to not only pause and reflect on the public health crisis, but also the ways in which we need to take collective action for other shared concerns like climate change, and other, you know, really pressing matters of urgency that, you know, that might take on more, you know, interest after this. So I don't know. I think there's probably a lot of ways that we could come back from this in ways that were better from before. I also, you know, remarkably, the other, and again, because I work in human rights, I guess I look at it more often than perhaps others, but I recall the fact that after World War II, it was the first time that states, like sovereign states, came together and actually, you know, acknowledged and recognized the individual agency of people and interstate relations, you know, which is an imposition of a constraint on state behavior. It didn't, you know, really manifest itself until much later in positive ways, but there's a lot of progress that happened under the surface, whereas now it's a much more natural state of affairs that, you know, that's the case. And that takes self-restraint on the part of states, and it takes cooperation, it takes tough choices, but it also takes innovation and some pretty bold thinking. So I don't know, I still have faith in us as a species.
And I mean, folks, we could close on that because that right there is exactly what we all need. But if you have other questions, now's the time. If you're on the Zoom call, go ahead and add that into the Q&A. If you are watching via Facebook Live, we do have some folks who are watching the Facebook Live as well. Feel free to go ahead and type your question into that space beneath the video. The first is actually just building off of the exact conversation that we were having. And it is from Shahid Qadri, I hope I said that correctly, who asked another question as well about terrorism and its future and kind of definitions that hopefully we might have a chance to get to. But the very specific was prompted by a thought that he had, thinking that the post-COVID socioeconomic and political reset may present an opportunity to eradicate the curse of terrorism. Will it?
I will take a stab at this just to say I'm speaking to somebody. I don't have their permission to say who they were, but I should attribute it to him as somebody who's a terrorism researcher who's been watching this for a long time. And his comment was that actually, in a sort of strange way, COVID has stolen the spotlight from terrorism and is starving it for the fuel of attention that it needs to survive. That doesn't mean it's going away. It just means that The world has sort of refocused on a different threat that's much more urgent. And part of the impact of terrorism really is the way that it's portrayed and the media carries it and how we perceive it. And so, at least for the moment, that's sort of a positive development. That doesn't mean that there are fewer terrorist groups attacks, and that these networks are not going to prey on the economic devastation in parts of the world that are left behind by what's going on. And so it's an evolving story, and it's a complicated story. And it goes back to a lot of what we've learned about how to counter terrorism, which is really getting to economic and development and human rights issues. I don't know if Dan has any additional perspective on that. I know he's looked at the issue closely.
No, I mean, I think this, this question of how we as a country, and I think internationally, move forward on questions related to cooperation on terrorism is going to be, I think we're at an inflection point of what it means, going forward, and how we recalibrate not only terrorism as a priority in a hierarchy of other priorities, but also the extent to which international cooperation has yielded some really positive fruit, but also some lessons that can be learned of the perhaps unforeseen and adverse consequences of closing space and allowing for restrictive measures in the name of countering terrorism that maybe could be applicable in a situation like this. So not just the lessons from counterterrorism for purposes of countering terrorism in the future, but the lessons of counterterrorism for purposes of international cooperation in response to a global challenge like coronavirus.
Our next question is actually a bit of a combination, one from Facebook and one from John Antel. You all have spoken of political leadership and a need for some potentially different responses to be occurring. A question on the domestic front was, with the election in 2020, is there a way that we might promote and get better cooperation to encourage some thoughtful change on the international front, but really in some ways on that domestic front as well, being a wealthy country who should donate to a crisis that also affects people at home? Should we be looking at or talking about some of these different categories? Is it more important for us to be talking about sustainable trade, to be talking about the kind of sense of being able to provide aid and relief packages, that desire to be kind of an ethical nation? Is there better for us to talk about putting an end to the crisis as part of the world order, and that we are a country who has to kick off this fundraising campaign, and that we are able to be that leader within the global community? Two questions smooshed together. Choose either part of that you would like to answer. Oh, Dan, I think you're still muted.
I was just going to say, and I will be brief this time. Look, I think if this is a question specific to the U.S., and I don't want to betray my political leanings, one could probably infer what they are, but I think if there were ever a moment of opportunity for the U.S. to get off the bench, like, this is it. We've kind of over the last couple of years taken a little bit of an antagonistic and critical, view of our role in international affairs, and kind of, our largesse perhaps has been called into question, perhaps with good reason, as aid budgets have gone down and cynicism about international organizations has gone up. But what better opportunity to say, look, we're going to double down our leadership role on the provision that we're able to, the things we're able to provide, not only to ourselves and our own people, but to others, and do it in such a way that provides reassurance to the American people that, look, we are going to reinvest in our own economy, our own infrastructure, our own our own people, but at the same time, we are a country of immense means, and I think we've got the capacity to do a lot more, and that could really put us back on the international stage in an important way. And why not, carry with that, a call for the kinds of political, I won't call them reforms, but the kind of political reformation that may be needed to give the most space and breathing room and oxygen to what we need as an international community to move forward in collective, sort of shared prosperity and security. Well, that almost sounded like a political speech. Just scratch that last line.
Yeah, I will say from just assessing the outcomes of the situation data, you know, is the United States on a stronger footing internationally? Is it more secure economically, in personal security than we were when we undertook a pretty radical departure from decades of foreign policy 3 years ago? And the answer is no. In all objective measures, the United States is in a weakened position. And so, you know, maybe there's some way to make sort of the doctrine that we've tried to put into place the last 3 years work. But I don't want to be part of that experiment. I was part of the experiment for the past 3 years, and it's not gone well. And I think when I look at issues of international security, be it relations with China or Russia, with European allies, with our neighbors to the south, everything is on a trajectory that is less than it was when we sort of pulled back from international engagement and from supporting international institutions we'd supported previously. Are they perfect? No. Is there a lot of room for improvement? Yes. And should we and can we lead that improvement? Yes. I think, you know, the good news story here is that people really still want the United States to lead on a lot of issues. And no one has been able to fill the void, for better or worse. So we're in a deteriorating and fragmenting international system. And it's not, I saw in another question, the question of, you know, is China sort of ascendant now if the United States is stepping back? And the answer is no. China is not, for many reasons, it's not equipped to lead the international community, and it's not welcome to do that by a lot of key stakeholders. And so you're sort of looking at leaderlessness versus the U.S. stepping back into its traditional role. I mean, we've run this grand experiment. We're at a critical point in it. If we choose in the 2020 election to sort of continue, and I'm not saying you have to choose a new president, could be a new party platform, could be all kinds of things. But if we sort of continue on the course that we're on, I think it really does spell the end of the period of history that we're in, an entry into something that looks a lot like what came in World War I and before, of these sort of very loose competing groups of, you know, balances of power and unpredictability and the potential for sort of mass casualty combat that comes out of that uncertainty.
I am going to give a nod to my junior year high school teacher. His name was Mr. Ed Fullerton, who said you should always take a look about 100 years after a nation rises to leadership. And that is a telling moment throughout history. Specifically, and I think, Dan, this question might be to you, from Richard Randolph. We are encountering floods and all sorts of major international disaster response needs right now. How do you see COVID-19 affecting that broader picture of international disaster response?
Wow, I mean, and I actually, you know, defer to Sam too for his thoughts on this. I know CSIS has done some really amazing global analysis of conflict and other dynamics, and the way that they're affected by the crisis. I mean, I think the simplest answer here is that disasters aren't going to end. In fact, disasters by any measure are getting worse year by year in terms of the overall effect and prevalence as a function of, you know, climate-related change. And I think the more the pandemic places the stress not only on political cooperation, but also the resources that are allocated to deal with disaster response, you know, we'll see predictable outcomes from that. Now, if the international community or individual states are able to and have the wherewithal to, you know, to develop stronger resiliencies or to invest greater resources or to recover in ways that make themselves or others more structurally insulated from disasters, which I think is a huge opportunity in the United States with this disaster season coming up this fall. You know, maybe there could be a silver lining to the cloud, but I think it's hard to generalize, but I think that would be the way I would characterize kind of the overarching phenomenon.
Nothing to add. Fully agree with Dan's assessment.
All right, so then my last question is going to be from Stephen Slaughter. You have both spoke optimistically of opportunities for global engagement within the scientific community. You have spoken of the opportunity of international coordination or cooperation. In a time of significant and polarizing distrust within our nation, are there ways that we can encourage that we can encourage a trust within the intellectual and scientific community, ways that we can encourage trust within our and for our government leaders?
I'll give Dan last word on this. I'll just say, I think actually, again, looking to U.S. history, we've had moments of great political polarization. I was just reading about the presidency of James Buchanan yesterday, and I felt better and worse in various ways, including the fact that it ends with the Civil War very quickly thereafter. But there are a number in the 19th century in particular. There are moments that look not so dissimilar from today, very close electoral match victories, very big differences of opinion on the future of the country. And often what follows those periods are ones of renewal and sort of radical new ideas taking hold that move the society forward. So again, I think I fall into the hopeless optimist camp that I think Dan expressed earlier, that just this is a moment when what you've been doing isn't working, and maybe you just move beyond it. There's something clicks, something happens, you find unity around issues. It's hard to see that right now. We're divided on everything. We're divided on the facts surrounding what's happening, and so it's difficult to see how we get there, but I think it was just as difficult to see how you got there in years past. So let's hope we're on the verge of one of those areas of American renewal.
That's why I love these events, because I can also sit back and listen and learn something from time to time. So I will refrain from adding anything additional, but yeah, I totally agree.
I will singularly add two things. One is just my thanks to you both for engaging in this incredibly important conversation, and a thanks to Matthew and to Evan for all of the work in putting this together. It really is such a delightful way to spend a Wednesday night. And just thank you, and thank you all for joining us in this conversation. The second thing that I would say is actually to echo Sam, some of what you mentioned about learning from history. In a memorial, it really isn't, a memorial is not built for the dead, it's built for the living. And on the base of our nation's World War I museum and memorial, back in the 1930s, they decided to put an inscription on this great frieze, which is like the size of a football field, and it's right across from what was the nation's busiest railway station, one of the busiest railway stations in the world. Most of the soldiers in World War II went through that station. It was just a space that would be seen. And when you write an inscription there, you're writing it to the future. And what they said was this: these have dared bear the torches of sacrifice and service. Their bodies return to dust, but their work liveth forevermore. And I'll pause to say that when we honor the dead of World War I, many of those are actually those who died because of the flu pandemic. And many of those were in industries to assist. They are the nurses, they were the doctors, they were in those communities. And that is considered part of, that's part of the casualties of World War I. There's a second sentence that calls out to us today. Let us strive on to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for letting me join you and moderate this conversation. I thank you very much. If you've liked it, share it with others. Go to the International Relations Council website, www.irckc.org. Join us at ours. And consider doing what Dan mentioned as well. Look around for places where you can become involved, whether that is through donation or your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much and have a good night.